What is up, everyone? My name is Joseph and welcome back to another Casually Competitive MTG gameplay video, where our goal is to bring you semi-competitive EDH content that is both fast-paced and entertaining. In today's match, due to the holidays and people being around a little bit more, we're able to get a few guests on the show, some of our other friends who aren't normally featured in these videos. They're playing some of their favorite decks and I think you'll really enjoy this video, so without any further ado, let's get into the opening hands and introductions. Going first today, we have Andrew playing his Teferi Temporal Archmage Mono Blue combo deck. This deck looks to control the board until it can assemble a combo with Chain Veil, which he can use to generate infinite mana by using Teferi's minus ability and just draw your deck with his plus ability, essentially just activating Teferi an infinite amount of times, drawing his library with infinite mana, and then winning through one of the many ways blue can win with their library in their hand. He unfortunately had to mulligan down to 5 cards, and his opening hand today contained a snow-covered island, a Lotus Veil, a Brainstorm, a Sapphire Medallion, and a Back to Basics, and due to the London mulligan, he bottomed a Stroke of Genius and a Dig Through Time. Going second today, we have Joseph playing a deck which has been featured quite a bit lately, but I don't think anyone really gets tired of seeing the frog. He's piloting Gitrog. This deck looks to assemble a combo using Dakmor Salvage's Dredge ability, a discard outlet, a shuffle effect, and the Gitrog monster in order to perform a many-stepped loop to draw your library, and then another similarly stepped loop to win the game. If you're curious on what these specific steps are, the deck list is in the description with a step-by-step guide on how to perform this loop. Joseph kept 7 cards in his opening hand today, and those cards contained a Forest, a Veil of Summer, an Arbor Elf, a Sylvan Library, an Arcane Signet, an Abrupt Decay, and a Yisan the Wanderer Bard. Going third, we have Jordan piloting his Azami Lady of Scrolls Mono Blue deck. This deck looks to play Azami early, get massive value off of tapping wizards to draw cards, and eventually winning through something like an Isochron Scepter and Dramatic Reversal to untap his wizards and continue to draw, or something like a Mind Over Matter that allows him to loot through his entire library. Jordan's opening hand today contained 2 islands, a Brainstorm, a Curse Catcher, a Rhystic Study, a Fabricate, and a Patron Wizard. Going last today, we have another guest to the channel, Nate L, piloting his Krenko Mob Boss deck. This mono-red deck looks to win by using Krenko's ability to create a massive amount of goblins and then win through maybe an Impact Tremors or just overwhelming the board, with backup win cons including a Kiki Jiki Zealous Conscripts combo. He kept 7 cards for his opening hand today, and those cards were 3 Snow-Covered Mountains, a Gamble, a Goblin Bombardment, a Byforce, and a Fervor. Now with our decks introduced and the opening hands gone through, let's get into the gameplay. Andrew starts us off today by drawing his card for turn, playing a snow-covered island, then passing the turn to Joseph. Joseph draws, plays a forest as his land for turn, then taps that forest for a Soul Ring. He then taps that Soul Ring to play an Arcane Signet, and then taps that Arcane Signet for a green to play an Arbor Elf. Feeling pretty satisfied, he gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan draws, plays an island as his land for turn, and then taps it to play a Curse Catcher. In response to the cast, Andrew taps his island to cast a Brainstorm, drawing 3 cards, and putting 2 back on top. Curse Snatcher then resolves, and Jordan passes the turn to Nate. Nate draws, and plays a snow-covered mountain as his land for turn. He then taps that mountain to cast a Gamble. He tutors up a card to his hand, and then discards a card at random, which is a Goblin Bombardment. He then casts a Mana Crypt for 0 mana, and then passes the turn to Andrew. Andrew untaps and draws, and plays a snow-covered island as his land for turn. He then taps both of his islands to play a Sapphire Medallion. And it resolves, and he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, draws, and plays an Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth as his land for turn. He then taps the Forest and Soul Ring to cast a Yisan. When that resolves, he taps Arbor Elf to untap a Forest, and then taps Urborg and a Forest to cast a Sylvan Library. Content with his turn 2 board state, he gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps and draws, plays an island as his land for turn, and then passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep does not take damage from Mana Crypt. He then draws and plays a snow-covered mountain as his land for turn. He then taps out completely to cast a Byforce, X equaling 3, targeting the Sapphire Medallion, the Soul Ring, and the Arcane Signet. Andrew and Joseph remove their artifacts from the battlefield, and Nate passes the turn back to Andrew. Andrew untaps and draws, and then plays a snow-covered island as his land for turn. He then taps 3 snow-covered islands to cast a Back to Basics, This enchantment resolves, and he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps his basic lands and his creatures, and then draws 3 cards due to Sylvan Library, opting to keep all 3, taking 8 damage. He then plays a forest as his land for turn, and passes the turn to Jordan. On Joseph's end step, Jordan taps for 1 blue mana to cast a Brainstorm, drawing 3 and then putting 2 cards back on top. He then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and plays an island as his land for turn. He then taps for 3 mana to cast a Rhystic Study. This Rhystic Study resolves, and Jordan gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and in his upkeep takes 3 damage from Mana Crypt from losing the Mana Crypt trigger. He then draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain as his land for turn. He then taps for 5 mana to cast Krenko, Mob Boss, making sure to pay for the Rhystic Study tax. With nothing left to do, he gives the turn to Andrew. Andrew untaps, draws, plays a Snow-Covered Island as his land for turn. He then taps for 4 mana to cast a Jace the Mind Sculptor, not paying the Rhystic Study tax, allowing Jordan to draw a card. He then uses the +0 loyalty ability on Jace to essentially Brainstorm, drawing 3 cards, putting 2 back on top. He then gives the turn to Joseph. On Andrew's end step, Joseph pays 3 mana to activate Yisan, putting a verse counter on him and tutoring up a 1-drop creature to the battlefield. The creature he tutors up is Putrid Imp. He then goes to his turn, untaps, draws 3 cards due to Sylvan Library, and again keeps all 3, taking 8 damage. He plays a Swamp as his land for turn, and then casts a Mana Crypt, not paying for the Rhystic Study tax. He then taps for 5 mana to cast the Gitrog Monster, and then taps another 1 to pay for the Rhystic Study tax, not allowing Jordan to draw. Gitrog resolves, and Joseph then discards an Emergence Zone to Putrid Imp to draw a card off of Gitrog's ability. He then plays a Llanowar Wastes as his second land for turn, and gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, draws, and plays an island as his land for turn. He then, not wanting to feel too left out, casts his very own Mana Crypt. He then taps for enough mana to cast Azami, Lady of Scrolls. Azami resolves, and Jordan gives the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, and in his upkeep takes 3 damage from Mana Crypt. He then draws, and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain as his land for turn. He then taps for 4 mana to cast an Imperial Recruiter, making sure to pay for the Rhystic Study tax, denying Jordan a card drop. Imperial Recruiter resolves, and as it enters the battlefield, Nate tutors up a Dockside Extortionist to his hand. He then taps for 2 mana to cast said Dockside Extortionist, not paying for the Rhystic Study tax, allowing Jordan to draw, and as it enters the battlefield, he creates 5 treasure tokens due to the amount of artifacts and enchantments his opponents control. He then sacrifices 3 treasures to generate 3 red mana to cast Fervor, then sacks 1 more extra to pay the Rhystic Study tax. He then taps Krenko to create 2 Goblin 1/1 tokens. He swings the 2 1/1s at Jace the Mind Sculptor, putting him at 1 loyalty. With nothing left to do, he passes the turn to Andrew. Andrew untaps and draws, and kills Jace using his -1 ability to bounce Gitrog to Joseph's hand. In response to the activation, Joseph taps Llanowar Wastes, taking 1 damage to generate a green to cast Veil of Summer, not paying for Rhystic Study. However, in response to this, Andrew pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting Veil of Summer, again, not paying the Rhystic Study tax, allowing Jordan to draw 1 more time. It resolves, Veil of Summer is countered, and Gitrog is bounced to Joseph's hand. He then plays a Snow-Covered Island as his land for turn, and taps this island to cast a Soul Ring, again, not paying for the Rhystic Study tax. He then taps out completely to play his commander, Teferi, Temporal Archmage, not paying the Rhystic Study tax. He then +1s to Teferi, looking at the top 2 cards of his library, putting 1 into his hand and 1 on the bottom. With nothing left, he gives the turn to Joseph. Joseph untaps, and on his upkeep does not take any damage from Mana Crypt. He then draws 3 cards due to Sylvan Library and only keeps 2 of them, taking 4 damage this time. He then taps for 1 mana to cast a Carpet of Flowers, making sure to pay the Rhystic Study tax. He then proceeds to go to combat and then to his second main phase and targets Andrew with the Carpet of Flowers trigger. However, in response to this trigger, Jordan taps for 1 blue mana to cast Stifle, targeting the Carpet of Flowers trigger. Stifle resolves, the Carpet of Flowers trigger is countered, and Joseph gets no mana from Carpet of Flowers. Before passing his turn, knowing how Jordan's deck plays out and knowing he's drawn a lot of cards, he taps for 3 mana to cast an Abrupt Decay, paying for Rhystic Study, targeting Jordan's Mana Crypt. In response, Jordan taps a Wizard to draw 1 card. Abrupt Decay resolves, Mana Crypt is destroyed, and Joseph gives the turn to Jordan. Jordan untaps, draws, and plays an island as his land for turn. He then taps for 3 mana to cast a Patron Wizard. It resolves, and he then taps for 2 mana to cast an Information Dealer. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps, and on his upkeep takes 3 damage from Mana Crypt, and then draws his card for turn. He then plays a Snow-Covered Mountain as his land for turn, and taps for enough mana to cast an Impact Tremors, making sure to pay the Rhystic Study tax. He then pays 3 mana to cast a Goblin King, making sure, again, to pay the Rhystic Study tax. This triggers Impact Tremors, and this deals 1 damage to each of his opponents. He then taps Krenko, and creates 5 1/1 Goblin tokens, dealing 5 damage to each opponent due to Impact Tremors. He then decides to go to combat, and since all of his goblins have haste, due to Goblin King, he sends 1 goblin, the Goblin King, and Dockside Extortionist at Teferi, with enough damage to kill it, and the rest of his goblins go at Joseph. Joseph blocks 2 of these 2/2 tokens and takes 9 total damage. Yisan is able to kill 1 of the 2/2 goblins, but another of the goblins killed Joseph's Putrid Imp. With nothing left, Nate passes the turn to Andrew. On his turn, Andrew untaps, draws, and casts a Basalt Monolith, paying the Rhystic Study tax. It resolves, and he then taps the Basalt Monolith, floating 3 colorless mana along with 2 islands for 2 blue, to cast a Transmute Artifact, paying the Rhystic Study tax. Transmute Artifact resolves, and he sacrifices the Basalt Monolith to search up a Memory Jar to the battlefield, paying the 2 mana for the CMC difference between Memory Jar and Basalt Monolith. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Joseph. Joseph goes to his turn, untaps, and wins his Mana Crypt trigger, not taking any damage. He then draws 3 cards to the Sylvan Library and decides it's probably wise to just keep 1 of them. During his first main phase, he adds 5 green mana to his mana pool due to Carpet of Flowers. He then uses 1 of that green mana to cast Savage Summonings, not paying the Rhystic Study tax. It resolves, and he then uses the 4 remaining green mana, along with 1 extra black mana, to cast an uncounterable Gitrog, not paying for the Rhystic Study tax. He then pays 3 mana into Yisan's ability, adding a verse counter and tutoring up a 2 mana cost creature to the battlefield. This creature is a Noose Constrictor. It enters the battlefield, and Joseph discards a City of Brass to Noose Constrictor and draws a card off of Gitrog's ability. He then discards a Mana Confluence, doing the same thing, drawing 1 more card. With nothing left and really not able to dig anymore, he passes the turn to Jordan. On Joseph's end step, Jordan activates Azami's ability 3 times by tapping 3 wizards, draws 3 cards, and then as he goes to do it a 4th time with his final wizard, Joseph taps for a green mana to cast a Nature's Claim targeting his own Mana Crypt. It resolves, Joseph gains 4 life, Jordan draws a card off the Rhystic Study tax not being paid, and then draws the card from the Azami activation. Jordan then goes to his turn, untaps, draws, and as he goes to move to his first main phase, Andrew sacrifices and activates Memory Jar. Now this may not be exactly clear why this was done, due to you not being able to see how many cards Jordan had in hand, but it was a large number. This was done in order to slow Jordan down as he goes to his turn. However, in response to this Memory Jar activation, Jordan taps for 1 blue mana to cast a High Tide, allowing all islands to now tap for an additional blue. And once that resolves, he taps 1 island for 2 blue to cast a Mystical Tutor, floating a blue mana. It resolves, and he tutors up a Dramatic Reversal to the top of his library. He then taps the rest of his lands, floating some mana to cast a Turnabout, targeting himself to untap his lands. And then with nothing left, the Memory Jar trigger resolves, everybody exiles their hands face down and draws 7 cards. Then Jordan moves to his main phase, and all of that floating mana fizzles. Now in his first main phase with High Tide active, he taps for enough mana to cast a Glen Elendra Archmage. It resolves, and he then activates Azami by tapping Glen Elendra to draw a card. However, in response to this activation, Andrew taps 1 of his islands for 2 blue to cast a Trick Bind, targeting Azami's ability, countering it, and not allowing it to be used for the entire turn. He does not pay the Rhystic Study tax, so Jordan does draw, but he does not draw off the Azami activation. Jordan then taps for enough mana to cast a Spellseeker, tutoring a Muddle the Mixture to his hand. He then transmutes Muddle the Mixture to tutor up an Isochron Scepter to his hand. He then taps Information Dealer to look at the top 6 cards of his library and puts them back in any order. Not really liking what he sees, he elects to not play Isochron, leaves his island untapped, and then moves to his end step. Everybody discards their hand due to Memory Jar and gets their exiled cards back, and Jordan then has to go to discards from his original hand. He discards down to 7 cards and then passes the turn to Nate. Nate untaps and takes 3 more damage from Mana Crypt, losing the Mana Crypt trigger. He then draws and taps his mana to cast a Mana Echoes, making sure to pay the Rhystic Study tax. Nate then taps Krenko Mob Boss and generates 9 more goblins, dealing 9 damage to each of his opponents, killing Joseph. Nate then full swings his board at Jordan for a total of 35 damage, and even with blocks, Jordan is not able to survive, and Jordan dies. With nothing left, he passes the turn to Andrew. Andrew untaps, draws, and then pays 2 life to cast a Gitaxian Probe, targeting himself. He looks at his own hand and then draws a card. He then sacrifices 2 of his untapped islands to play a Lotus Veil. He then taps out completely to replay his commander, Teferi. He uses the +1 ability on Teferi to look at the top 2 cards of his library, put one into his hand and the other on the bottom of his library. However, he was not able to find anything he could use and has to pass the turn back to Nate. Nate untaps, wins his Mana Crypt trigger, not taking any more damage, and draws a card for turn. He then taps Krenko to make 18 more Goblin tokens, dealing 18 damage to Andrew as they enter, and since they have haste and +1/+1, he turns them sideways and swings them all at Andrew, finishing off his final opponent. As I do at the end of all of these gameplay videos, I want to take a few minutes to kind of just do a little post-game discussion, and we're going to start off with talking about the most valuable card. In this game, there were quite a few cards that were very useful and had a lot of good interaction, but I am going to have to give probably the single most valuable card to that Bifrost. Being able to kind of shut down Joseph's early game in his turn 1 and slow down the mono blue Teferi deck just a little bit was incredibly relevant in order to keep everyone on kind of the same level as the mono red Krenko deck. It might not have been incredibly game changing, but it definitely was a good play at the time in order to keep everyone at least at his speed for a few turns so he could catch up. And in the long term, it did end up helping by allowing him to get Krenko out at the right time. Denying mana from those 2 really slowed them down, and it allowed him to eventually win the game. Now, I don't really want to spend this time to talk about any poor card choices or any poor plays that were made, but I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about something that was relevant in this game, and that topic is knowing your opponent's deck. And this was actually very relevant in the game we had. When Joseph cast Abrupt Decay targeting Jordan's Mana Crypt, we found out later that Jordan actually had Mind Over Matter in hand. Now, this might not be something you would realize if you were playing against it blind or if you didn't take time to really understand what a mono blue deck like Azami can do. The amount of mana that Azami had was perfect, and Azami had been drawing quite a few cards with even more available card draw on their turn. So after being slowed down so much and not being able to do much, being able to deal with and recognize what a possible threat would be towards Jordan board was very relevant and actually stopped Jordan from winning the game that turn. Now, in hindsight, it didn't benefit the Gitrog player that much as he still wasn't able to win the game, but it did extend the game for a few more turns, which allowed the Gitrog player to dig a little bit deeper and potentially find the right cards that he needed to win the game in the turns that were left. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that. But that is all we have for this video. We all here at Casually Competitive really hoped you enjoyed this gameplay video. We had a good time playing these decks and we hope you enjoyed watching it. But unfortunately, that is all we have for today's video. We do have many more videos planned in the very near future, and we think you'll enjoy all we have in store for you. That being said, make sure to like the video if you did like it, subscribe if you're not already. I am Joseph, this is Casually Competitive MTG, and we will see you next time.